Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to get started shortly. My name is Chris Murray. We're going to be getting started in about 7 minutes. We have a lot of people joining already. Glad to see that. I've gone ahead and put some links in the chat. There's lots of people happening, lots of people joining quickly. So my posts have been kind of bumped down a little bit, but scroll down and look for my name and some links to some files, and we'll be getting started shortly. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to be getting started in about 5 minutes. So come on in, make yourselves comfortable. We're posting some links to some class files so that you can check out and see what it is that we're doing within the webinar. So go ahead and grab those. We're going to be doing some polls as well shortly. We'll be getting started right at the top of the hour. So stay tuned, and we'll be back in a minute. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in about 4 minutes. So sit back, relax, stay tuned. I posted a link in the chat as a sticky message at the top of the chat column. So hopefully you all can see that. And that's where you can get the files that we'll be referring to in today's webinar. So stay tuned, and we'll be getting started in about 3 minutes. Hi, everyone. About 2 more minutes and we'll be getting started. 2 minutes and we'll get started right at the top of the hour. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. This is the Unreal Engine and Design Visualization webinar number 4. My name is Chris Murray. I'm the Technical Marketing Manager for Unreal Engine Enterprise. Joining me today is Fabrice Borelli. He's a professional 3D visualizer and has been leading us through this entire series of webinars. Webinars 1, 2, and 3, and we're glad he's back today with us. Also joining us today is Wes McDermott from Algorithmic, and we're going to be covering a lot of information about Substance and PBR materials, and so we're glad to have him with us as well. We have a completely packed webinar today. Normally, our webinars are about 40, 45 minutes, and then some Q&A. We have a full hour's worth of material before we hit QA. It's amazing. So I'm hoping that everyone can stick around for the entire thing. And to that end, what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be making things look awesome in Unreal Engine. We're going to be talking about materials, specifically how you can incorporate PBR materials into your workflows. What does PBR actually mean? How to employ it? How to really take advantage of everything that it offers in Unreal Engine. We'll be looking at Substance for architectural visualization. We'll be getting into Substance Designer a little bit, and you can see how Wes assembles some of his great looking materials, and really, talking about the creation of textures and materials in general. Real quickly, I want to let you know about classroom chats and polls. Obviously, I think most of you have actually found the chat over on the right side of the screen. This is where you can ask questions. If you have a question that you want to ask during the webinar, if you click the little button to the left of the field where you enter in your comment, that will designate, click that button and you'll get a chance to designate that comment as a question. That helps us on our end. We're able to kind of filter out the questions so that we can find them easily when it comes time to QA. So please take advantage of that. The other thing that we're going to do occasionally throughout the webinar today is polls. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and load a poll right now so that you can see how it works. If you can go ahead and answer that question, I'll be kind of doing this throughout the webinar. And just gauging, what the room is learning and things like that. So we can see just by looking at this poll that we have a pretty good group of people who are relatively new. We have some advanced folks, but we also have a fair amount of intermediate and beginner as well. So I'll give that poll a chance to settle. And while that's settling, just to let you know, we will be doing Q&A at the end. While Fabrice and Wes are presenting, I'll be present as well, but and in the chat rooms, but we will be doing a much bigger Q&A at the end. So if we don't answer your question in the chat, don't worry. We'll try to get to it at the end. And at the end as well, you'll be receiving an email after the webinar is complete. And in that email, with a link to the replay, is also a link to our survey. We would really appreciate it if you would fill out our survey. It's very important that we understand how we're doing and we're covering the information that you want to cover. So let me go ahead and switch over back to the chat. Okay, that's great. Joining us today, like I said, is Wes McDermott from Substance. Substance, they've been around for 14 years. They have offices all over the world in France, Los Angeles, my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, Montreal, and Seoul. They're a really fast growing company. They have over 110,000 active users and 150,000 subscribers to their newsletter. So they're very popular. You've probably seen or heard about them. They make great tools for generating really high quality, very realistic materials. More than 90% of all of the major AAA game projects are using the tool on a daily basis. But really their growth at the moment is in design manufacturing and design visualization. So we're really happy that they're joining us today, and that Wes is going to share some insights and some secrets into making some really great looking materials that you all can employ immediately. Also with us, and again, my partner in crime on this webinar series is Fabrice Borelli. Fabrice has a new lighting course. Webinar number 3 in this series was a lighting webinar, and here he really takes a much deeper dive into that topic. You can get more at the URL that's on the screen there, and he may actually put a live link in the chat if he gets a chance to do that, so we're glad to have him with us as well. And of course, since a lot of you, according to the poll, are new to Unreal Engine, you may not be completely aware of what Epic Games and Unreal Engine is all about. Epic has been around for 18 years, making an amazing real-time award-winning engine. We develop our games on our own engine, so we're in the trenches with you. If you experience problems and issues in your workflow, we're experiencing those same things, and we're working to fix them. We noticed about 18 months ago that a lot of people are using the Unreal Engine for things that have absolutely nothing to do with a game. And that's where Enterprise comes in. Enterprise is focused strictly on issues that are related to design visualization, manufacturing, automotive, simulation. It's, not game stuff. It's real world enterprise stuff, and that's where we're focused. There's over 3 million users worldwide of the engine, and of course, the engine continues to be free and will remain free as well. So in today's webinar number 4, previously we did webinars 1, 2, and 3, and those webinars were the introduction to the capabilities of UE4 in architectural visualization. It's not a requirement for today. I will be putting a link to the first 3 webinars in the chat shortly. Today's webinar is really a next step deep dive into materials and algorithmic substance. The first webinar was kind of a broad overview. The second webinar was more about geometry and getting stuff into the engine. Webinar number 3 was about lighting, and today is about materials. Coming up, we have a webinar on November 9th that is not part of the AEC series, but it's an introduction to Datasmith, which I'll be talking about here in a minute. And on November 30th is webinar number 5 in this series, VR production in Unreal Engine. So that's where we are and where we're going. So at SIGGRAPH, we announced our new workflow toolkit called Datasmith. And the purpose of Datasmith is to really make the process of going from 3ds Max into Unreal Engine a lot easier. We're not using the FBX workflow. This is our own exporter that preserves texture maps on objects. It preserves and converts material shaders. We support V-Ray and Corona. It has some geometry tools, some automatic unwrapping for UV light map UVs. We preserve lighting information, including IES files, and we preserve camera information, including physical cameras. So this is really a way to move quickly to get your content into the Unreal Engine. And like I said, we announced beta on that. So the link for the beta, if you haven't signed up, is right there, unrealengine.com/beta. So go ahead and sign up now, and we can get you in the queue to receive that. So like I said, we have a lot to cover today. I'm going to unshare my screen and bring in Wes and Fabrice. They have a lot to cover, and
hello.
All right. So I have Wes. Hey, Wes, how's it going?
Hey, pretty good. How are you guys?
Good. And I heard Fabrice join in. I think he's about to share his screen. Fabrice, are you there?
Yep. Can you hear me?
I can. All right. I'm going to turn off my camera and my mic, but I'll be in and around the chat if you need me, and I turn it over to you guys.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new webinar of number 4. So yes, about materials. It's very exciting. We've got Wes here and Allegorithmic. You know, these guys live and breathe materials and textures. And so it's really great to have Wes, who's going to offload huge amounts of knowledge onto us. So get ready. Right. Just a little recap. You know, we did the webinar number 2 about workflow, and we touched on materials. There was an introduction to this material editor, which is a node-based, which is extremely powerful with all these amazing functions over there, and lots of different materials we can do, different types of materials. But the main thing that's going to be new for us, and I mean us, so people who would come from whether it's architectural visualization in 3ds Max or AutoCAD or SketchUp, is this physically based workflow. So I'm not going to go into detail now because that's what Wes and I are going to talk about in just a minute. But there is something that we're coming from, which is this 3ds Max material editor we've even got ambient color, you know, specular level, self-illumination, all of these things. And we've got to transfer over to metallic roughness specular. So there is going to be some emotional labor to mainly unlearn lots of tricks and tips that we would apply. Well, I certainly do. I took from my experience, there's a lot of things that I have to just basically stop doing. So it's important to set this up properly, and that's what we're going to do with Wes. After that, I'm going to show you a little bit the scene that I created for the webinar, and how we can play with this new Substance Source button in the new plugin that's just become available on the marketplace. Then Wes is going to show us the interface in Substance Designer and really create this very extremely simple material that is very effective. And I'm going to show you how I take this into this lobby scene and this exact same material into this the interior, but you can see that they both look very different. So this is coming up, so make sure you stay till the end to see how that's working. So now, Wes, everybody's eagerly waiting for your input on how to use these substances. So if you do yours, so hopefully that will all stay.
I just had to get my screen share working there, so we should be good to go.
Yeah, excellent.
Yep.
Yeah,
you're good.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Fabrice. Like I said, everybody, welcome to the webinar. It's very awesome to be here, and very excited to be able to present with Fabrice. So what we're going to do is just jump right in, and we're going to start talking about PBR. And so one of the first things I like to do is just discuss, you know, what's a general, you know, just a general statement about PBR. And you can really wrap it up by defining it as a method of shading and rendering that just basically provides a more accurate representation of how light interacts with surfaces. And so from that, we can, you know, we can get 3 benefits to working this way. So number 1, it's easier to create the materials as it removes the guesswork from authoring surface attributes. And by that, I mean, And Fabrice will have a lot to say about this as well. I come from, been a 3D artist for a very long time. So I come from the old traditional shaders where, we were using a lot of tricks and things like, let's take ambient occlusion or some lighting information and multiply it into a diffuse map, or different types of Fresnel tricks and so on to try to get maybe a metal to look like metal and so on. And so
I just interrupt you a little bit here. It's what I was saying. We've got all these tricks, for example, I'm thinking about painting a diffuse map to put in some use in it, some grunge in it, and this is typically what we have to stop doing, leave the diffuse as it is, and we're going to go into detail about that. Less tricks.
Exactly. Yes. And as we'll see, it really simplifies the process because, now I don't have to guess what a certain metal is. Based on PBR, we're going to be using, scientifically measured data. So I can just use that data. I can let the shader do all the heavy lifting. And then myself as the artist, I can get back to concentrating more on the creative aspect. So I really love that, I'm no longer having to guess about what a material is. I just plug the data in and it works. Which brings me to the next point is that materials will look correct in all lighting conditions. So let's say that we have a specific type of ceramic or a metal and, we can throw different environment maps at it. We can change the lighting. And because it's based on physically, the laws of physics, then that material will look like metal in any type of lighting condition. So
again, another problem that we've found many times is very difficult to author metal. I've always found, and always having to play with the reflection color and the amount of reflection. And here, again, the material will do the work, will behave correctly for us.
Yeah, and coming from traditional workflows, I'm sure we've all been in this situation where, you do this intricate lighting setup to, okay, this looks fantastic, and it's only going to look good at that camera angle, or in that lighting setup. So again, it just provides, which brings me to the third point, is that provides a workflow for creating consistent artwork. So we know that the workflow that we use to creating maps for creating metals and non-metals, that is going to be consistent across any types of maps we're creating, regardless of the scene, which is really great. So with that, I am going to jump over to here my next slide. So let me just get this going here. All right, so what we're going to do now is start to take a look at the specific map types themselves. These are going to be the maps that we plug into the UE4 material. So it's channel inputs. And the first one I like to talk about here is base color. And this map is actually going to be, or it's going to contain two specific types of information. The first being diffuse reflected color. Now, sometimes you'll hear this referred to as albedo. And by diffuse reflected color, this is color that we see. So for example, it's a light ray bounces off a surface and certain rays are absorbed, and what's reflected back to my eye, that's the color that I'm going to end up seeing. So for example, I'm sitting here, I've got a wood table and this wood color, that's going to be that albedo, and we're talking about that raw reflected color. So the other piece of information is going to be the metal color tint, or that reflectance value for metal, and that's going to be reflected light. And so, like I said, these are two different pieces of information. Both of them are going to represent color, and this information is going to be denoted based on a metallic map.
Yeah, I just to roll back a little bit here, Wes, for those of you who are completely new to the material editor, effectively what we're saying here is that the inside of Unreal, there are two types of materials. So we've got the non-metal, that there's no other word for it, as I know, that's what we call also here in this slide, actually, dielectric. And the metal color, so metallic. So we have two types of metal, the metallic and the non-metallic.
So we could look at non-metals as dielectric materials and the metal materials being conductive. And so, like I said, this metallic map that we have is another map that we author. It's just a simple mask, black and white. So white means that the surface is metallic and black means that it's non-metallic. So what happens is you look at the metallic map and the surface, so you feed this into the shader looks at that and says, oh, okay, I see a metallic map, there's a white area. And then what it does is it looks at that white area, goes over to the base color in that course that matches with that corresponding metallic map area, and it says, okay, that was white. So this value that I'm sampling from the base color, that is going to be the metallic, the metal reflectance value, or the metal color tint. So then, same thing, the shader looks at the metal map and it says, oh, I see black. So any corresponding areas of that black area in the base color is going to represent the dielectric or non-metal, and it's going to be the albedo color. And so that's how the system works. Base color, 2 pieces of information. So what we have here in the slide, so I'm just going to grab my handy laser pointer here. And so you'll see that we have this couple little bullet points here where I have some ideas about map guidelines. And these are going to be specific guidelines when we're talking about dielectric, so that's non-metals, and this is going to be the diffuse reflected color, or albedo. And so one of the first things that you want to do is make sure that you have no lighting information embedded into this. So I had talked in the previous slide about the materials looking right in all lighting conditions, and that is a byproduct of working with PBR. But in order to ensure that this works, we need to make sure that we author our maps to be physically correct as well. And so again, here, these are some of these guidelines. So the first one, devoid of lighting information.
I stop you again because this is just to highlight an old workflow we have all of grabbing an image off the internet, say a texture, a brick texture or something, and then throwing that into our base color or diffuse color channel. Well, this is going to start setting things off, then making things not work correctly, because we'll have the diffuse, the lighting information in the diffuse because it's just a photo of the real world. So I know you've got some products in Substance bitmap to material that is going to sort this problem out.
Yeah, that's correct, Fabrice. So like if, and that is a very viable way to work. Like if you have some textures either that you grab online or you have part of your material library, you can feed those through bitmap to material, and there are tools to remove that lighting information as well as help make the texture tileable. So yeah, we want to make sure that that map is devoid of lighting information. Speaking of that, the albedo, we want to look at kind of the tonality range of that image. So going from dark to bright values. And so with that, I have a guideline here about your dark values that you're going to author. So you don't want to drop any values below 30 sRGB. And here I'm talking about the 0 to 255 scale, because that's typically where we're going to author our maps, whether it be in, say, Substance or Photoshop. So here we just want to make sure that we don't set colors too dark. And one example I like to say is if we look at something like a lump of coal, we might say, oh yeah, that's super, super dark. That's a very, very dark material. So we wouldn't just set that to be black, 000 black. Actually, in the real world of that, it is not exactly black. So nothing is truly black and nothing is truly white. So we want to make sure that we stay within kind of this little range here, which I like to say is just, less than 30 sRGB. Same thing with our bright values. If we look at an example like snow, you might be tempted to say, oh, it's snow, it's white, let's just make it 255. But technically, though, it's not actually white. It's, a bit, just a little less. And so here you can see that we're at 240 sRGB for bright values. So if you stay within this kind of confines within creating your between your dark and bright values, you'll know that you're authoring an albedo map that's going to work physically correct.
Yeah, I was going to reiterate that we're now thinking physical world. So in the physical world, there is no absolute black, I guess, apart from black holes. and similarly, there aren't any, extremely bright values. Everything is going to be within that range, and the absolute 0 black and 255 white will be digital values that would only exist as theoretical values in the computer, effectively. Yeah,
that's correct, Fabrice. So just following these guidelines will help you to create that base color, the albedo portion of that, to be physically correct. So with that, we're going to switch over here to the next slide, which is also talking about our base color. So here we're looking at base color. This here is represents the value that I'm using here for the metal. So you'll notice in this case, this material, we're looking at a metal here, and the metallic map is set to white. So like I said, again, the shader knows to say, okay, for whatever area of white is in this metal map, I'm going to look to the base color, and I'm going to use that as the metal reflectance value to use. And so metals are going to be, 60 to 100% specular, 60, 70, I'll say, to 100% specular. And so you can see here that we have these metal tint values for things like gold, silver, aluminum, iron, so on. And these values are actually pretty bright. And here you can see the corresponding sRGB values to these, and the values are pretty bright values.
So yeah, I was going to say that again, we're talking about the base color, but then because now we're talking about a metallic, a material that will behave like a metal, the base color will be bright, very bright, above. A lot of these values are above 240, like said in the previous slide.
Yeah, and so metals absorb light at different wavelengths. So for example, if we look here at this gold, it absorbs blue light at the high frequency end of this visible spectrum. So it appears yellow as a result, and that's where we're getting this metal tint. Now, kind of going back to this idea of, well, where are we getting these values from? This is where we come to that measured value. So these aren't just values that we guess. We don't just look and say, okay, well, let's just choose this gold. This is actually a specific value that's been measured. And so these are just, you can find charts online. I look at the charts that were provided by Sebastian Lagarde, who I refer to as the best reference for PBR. And so I just go to his site and use the charts that he has provided. And that's what I have here. So these charts are actually coming straight from Sebastian Lagarde. And so we're going to just put these value in. So I don't have to guess what iron is. I know what the value is. So this is going to be the value that I use, and I know it's going to be physically correct. So again, here, I don't have to worry about it. And so this is going to kind of wrap up what we have here for our base colors. So like we said, we have two pieces of information: diffuse reflected color, and then here, this metal tint or metal reflectance value. So now, moving over to the next slide, we have our roughness map. Now, this map is very important as well, and this describes the microsurface detail. And so that's basically in charge of how the light is scattered across the surface. So for example, here in this graph, I have this black line just indicates a rough surface. So the yellow lines coming in, you can see these are light rays. And as they hit the surface, they're going to be reflected off in different directions. And what this does is it diffuses the light. And so we can simulate this in our physically based shader by using a roughness map. And that roughness map denotes white as rough and black as smooth. And this map here is going to be the most creative map you have. You have no rules on this. There's nothing you can do. You cannot screw this map up. You just go in and start to add the details you want. And the more rich and varied you make this map, the more realistic your surface is going to look. Yeah,
and I like to even add to this that this is where our materials really are going to come to life, because it's affecting the reflecting value of the materials. So in a for example, a stone that's been touched a lot maybe will be more reflective in those areas, and it's really in the roughness that this very, very tiny detail, these clues to how the material will actually feel to the touch. I know we've got the normal map for that, but the normal, as I understand it, will take care of larger details, whereas the roughness will take care of those absolutely tiny grains, like you can see here in that metal ball, and will give those clues of how the material will feel to the touch. And this is something that's been a completely new concept to me, that it all happens in one texture map.
So here we have the next slide, and this one is pretty important. So there's a lot of numbers and things like this on this slide, and so it's a bit complex, but it's very important to understand. And so this slide here, we're going to be talking about the specular channel in the UE4 material and what that actually means. So this channel is not the type of input that you may be used to from a more traditional workflow. This isn't like, okay, we're going to add a specular map into here. It's not the diffuse specular map that you're used to from traditional workflows. Now, it's basically set on a constant value you can feed into this. Now, you could also use a map as well to denote this value, but this input to this channel is actually going to have a specific range that goes from 0 to 1. And I'm talking specifically about the UE4 material input, so a constant value of 0 to 1. And what this value represents is this section right here that we call the F0, which means the Fresnel at 0 angle. So the Fresnel itself, the BRDF, is handled or hard-coded into the PBR shader. So we don't have to author that. We don't have to worry about it. Again, it's another one of those things that let science do its thing, and I'm just going to be creative and do what it is I want to do. And I don't have to worry about this. So we have this Fresnel. Now, the F0 is going to have a specific value to it, which we'll get to in a moment. And then that Fresnel angle is going to come up to 100% when we get to this grazing angle here at 90. So this is going to be 0. And as this angle moves up to 90, this grazing angle, 100% reflective. Now, again, going back to this F0 angle, which is going to be 0 degrees, this value is going to be hard-coded in the shader to be 4% reflective. Now, this is specific to non-metals. So again, in our metallic map where we have black, that's when this 4% value takes over. So in the reflectance value for the metal, you actually author that in the base color map as we discussed. But for the non-metals or dielectrics, you don't author that. It's just hard-coded in the shader at 4%. But this specular channel input gives you the ability to override that default 4% at Fresnel 0 angle. And that's what that's all about. So I had mentioned before that this range goes from 0 to 1. So here, if we look at this little diagram that I have here, you can see that on the left, I've got the 0%, and then here on the right, I have 8%. So this is the range that the shader uses. It can go from 0 to 8% at the maximum reflective, so 8%. And UE4 remaps this value of 0 to 8 to 8 to 1. So 0 is 0, and 8% is equal to 1. So if you were to take that constant value and feed into the specular channel a value of 0.5, that would give you 4%. So like I said, that's what it is by default. And this is typically something that you really never need to change. And if you check the UE4 documentation on this channel, they'll even say in there, hey, we don't recommend you messing with this. However, there are some cases where you may want to. So for example, some common dielectric materials can vary their F0 reflectance from around 2 to 5%. So you can see we can get a little bit of variation between these. Now, if we look at this gradation that we have within this, and let's see, I think my PowerPoint's kind of freezing up on me again a little bit, Fabrice. So be ready in case there's a problem.
Okay, I'm ready.
Yeah, but 2 to 5%. You can see this kind of grayscale ramp here. It really doesn't change that dramatically. So the difference between, say, 4 and 5, you may not even be able to see that visually, especially when you start to layer on top of that a really detailed roughness map and so on. But again, UE4 gives you the capability to change that if you need to. So the important thing is that when you feed a data into that specular channel, you are really only changing this F0 value for a non-metal. And if you're working in Substance Designer, we also mimic this same workflow from UE4, but however, we call that channel specular level. However, it's also remapped just like it is in UE4, going from 0 to 1, representing 0 to 8%.
So to recap on this, the main thing to take away is leave it alone. And as you said before, even in the Unreal Engine documentation, they say leave it alone. You don't really need to use this. And typically, I would use the specular channel to break up the reflections a little bit, but that's now going to be done in the roughness. So there's practically no need to interact with the specular. So it's one of these things that we would probably you'd be used to doing a lot of work with the specular channel before, but now leave it alone.
Yeah, and again, it's here for specific use cases. Like, for example, let's say that you needed to work on something like gemstones or something. Again, we would need to change it in that point. So for, like I said, common dielectrics, and we're talking about almost, plastics, wood, concrete, and so on, like, those are all going to fall within this exact range here, which is really going to be very subtle in the differences. But if you have something that's not common, something like you're working on something specifically, let's say a gemstone, then yeah, you have it here and you can change that hard-coded 4% value. So now we'll just move to the next slide if I can. And so here we go.
Yeah.
There we go. Sorry. I guess that slide is just heavy and PowerPoint doesn't even want to deal with it, you know? Okay, so it looks like it switched. All right, so just to kind of sum everything up here, I like to look at kind of the overall key factors. We talked about the benefits, but let's talk about the kind of overall key factors of PBR. So number one, energy conservation. It's handled by the shader. We don't have to worry about it.
So by energy conservation, we're talking about this physical fact that however much energy arrives on the surface is the same amount of energy that is going to leave. So that again is we're used to our reflection, sort of breaking up our reflection in ways or another, but this is all handled by the shader, and it means that we're going to have our work simpler, basically working with the roughness.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have to worry about it. We just know it's going to work physically correct. Same thing with Fresnel. That's my number 2 here. Fresnel, it's the BRDF, and that's also handled by the shader. We don't have to mess with that as well. Then here I have a point on number 3 here, how specular intensity is controlled through the BRDF, roughness map, and that F0 reflectance value. So when we look at this, you've got your BRDF, which we're not going to mess with, and the specular input, which you're probably not going to mess with. So that leaves us there really with our roughness map that you kind of talked about earlier, Fabrice, on how we're going to use that roughness map to really change, you know, the dynamic of how that light's being displaced on the surface, which affects the sense of reflectivity. The same amount of light is still being reflected, it's just being diffused.
Yeah.
And then my last point here, that's a key factor of PBR, is that lighting calculations are computed in linear space. So we're talking about a linear workflow. Now that's really complicated, so we don't have to worry about, we don't have to get into that. But there's one specific aspect of this that I like to mention. So like I said, all the computations and lighting calculations are done in linear space. So that does have an effect on our maps. So here, if I come over to my last slide, you'll see here that I have a metallic map that I've imported into UE4. And here, you're going to need to be able to flag the maps so that they are interpreted correctly by the shader. And it's actually pretty simple. You're just going to have a switch here that's sRGB, and you're either going to turn this on and off. So if it's a color map, meaning that it's color that we see, so that's going to be basically our base color. And again, that's our metal tint value and going to be our albedo, then we want to make sure that sRGB is enabled. We want to be able to tell the shader that, hey, this was authored in a gamma corrected space and you're going to need to linearize this. Again, we don't have to worry about it. The shader will do it. We just need to leave sRGB enabled. Now that's the default. Now, on the flip side of that, though, if we have data that comes in that we need to interpret as linear, then we just need to make sure sRGB is unchecked. So that's the change that you'll need to make with your map. So that's going to be things like your roughness, your metallic, your ambient occlusion, and your normal map. So all of those maps represent data, and they just need to be flagged as linear. So you just uncheck sRGB, and that'll take care of that for the shader. So one other kind of thing about that, if you've noticed that if you bring your map into, let's say, UE4, and you're looking and the gloss, you know, the reflections look off or something, just, you know, hey, this should look rougher than it is. The chances are it's just because you forgot to flag this. And I do that constantly.
Yeah, I mean, me too.
Yeah.
And so for a long time, I've been looking at this PBR workflow and understanding it. And I have to say is when I learned that the data textures need to be presented linearly inside of Unreal, everything started falling into place. Especially the roughness, it just worked. So this is extremely important.
Yeah, and with that too, when we're talking about these PBR materials, now when we author maps, we're being able to look at all these channels at the same time as a material, which, again, Fabrice, you're probably in the same boat as me, but coming from that traditional workflow, I was used to authoring one map at a time in its own isolated area. But with PBR, we're looking at this as a full material. And with that, we need to also be very aware of the environment and how that lighting is portrayed. So here I have this skylight cube map, and here you can see I have an HDR map that's enabled into here. So this is really going to make metals, you know, look like metals. So for example, if you have a metal and the map is authored correctly, but your environment is basically black or it's really uniform, like just going from like a dark value to maybe a bright like a light, like a sky, like maybe a lighter blue to a darker blue, you're not going to see this represented as like it's not going to look like metal because there's nothing for it to reflect. So again, we're talking physically based. We need to think about physics in the real world where the metal is reflecting. You're getting all that kind of metal look because it's reflecting that environment. And just by throwing a cube map here into your skylight, you can achieve that.
Yeah. So if your metals don't look right, work on the environment.
Yeah. So Fabrice, that kind of concludes what I wanted to go through here with the this kind of PBR kind of theory and map guidelines section.
Great. Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. I'm going to take over the screen now, and I'm on. So I was looking at the substance source materials, and I saw this great material here, very complex, that reminded me of a beautiful project by Peter Zumthor in Switzerland called Vals. It's a spa. So I just thought I'd show you a little bit how I worked on this, downloading the substances, and how the new plugin works. It's just been released, and you can download it from the marketplace today. You do need to be on version 4.17, though. And so what happens is that when you open this substance source, it gives you a... so I've actually need to log in here. So I'll wait for it to... Oh, yeah, here we go. So you can view all these amazing materials, and there's some free ones here as well, right from inside of Unreal Engine. And when you click on them, it downloads them straight into your folder. So I've downloaded a few here, and you can see that they're extremely high quality. So if I just literally drag and drop a new material right onto my mesh, you can see there's incredible amount of detail, and they really work very, very well. So this makes it incredibly easy to just very quickly swap and try some new things, some new materials, and there'll be no authoring to do. You know, all these different maps we're talking about, diffuse roughness, will be done for us. So with this one, it worked very well, but you see that the scale, that texture map is got slightly different resolution or different look to it. So I was able to then grab that instance material here, and within that, sorry if I get the right one. This is the one I've just moved away. Hang on, let me open the right one. So I within these, I'll just close this one to avoid confusion. I get all these parameters within that substance, which will update in real time. So I'm not going to do it now because it takes a little bit of time to update, because it's quite a complex material. But you can see that that would have been very, very tricky to do in Photoshop, and literally I was able to download it and customize it very, very quickly. I mean, almost no time, and all this inside of Unreal Engine. So this is really going to make a lot of difference if we want to work quickly. So let's have a look at Substance Designer now, and Wes is going to show us how to author something very, very simply with great result. So Wes, when you're ready, I'll just take my...
Just to let everyone know, we are at 40 minutes past the hour, so hopefully we have around 20 minutes left, and then we'll hit Q&A.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris and Fabrice. So now we'll just jump over here into Designer and start to look at, just some concepts in authoring some of these materials. And so, Fabrice, like you were saying with Substance Source, one thing I like to mention is some of the content that you'll see. We have kind of a split where some of those contents are authored procedurally, as we're kind of showing here, and then a good portion of those are actually being derived directly from scan data as well. And so, Designer gives us the ability to work with scans. So we've got a mix of hybrid of scans, textures, or procedural, all there within Substance Source. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just kind of run through a process where I'm just going to, create a very basic material here in Designer. And so Substance Designer is a node-based interface, similar to UB4's material editor. However, the type of nodes that we have are a bit simpler. I feel like they're more about compositing type nodes. So for example, we have something like a blend here. We have blending modes and opacity. We have levels, things like a transform node and so on. So it's more like using a digital compositing software to basically composite your textures than it is working with math nodes.
And Wes, the way I see them as well is it's a little bit like having your Photoshop history laid out in front of you, where all these levels and blends and transforms are all very familiar terms that we know from Photoshop. But here we're able to go back without having to redo everything. So it's like having your undo redo all laid out in front of you.
Yeah, exactly, Fabrice. And here, as you'll see, we have this nonlinear pipeline as we work through these nodes. So again, it's completely non-destructive. And speaking of that, here you can see that I can change my resolution. So in this particular case, if I wanted to switch this to say 2048, I was at 4K. What it's doing is you saw the graph just recompute. So it's not like Photoshop resize where I have a texture and I'm just resizing it up and down. Substance Designer is actually redrawing all of this information. So what I get is a true 2K or a true 4K or even a true 8K image as I start to recompute these nodes. Okay, so just to kind of jump in and give you an idea of kind of how I'm working here. So I would also like to share a little bit about my overall workflow. So what I do is I always work grayscale first. So here you'll notice that I'm working with my height information. So once I get the height information, I go through a map extraction phase, which is where I start to create my color map, my normal map, ambient occlusion, and this here is my roughness. And all of those get compiled down into this one single base material node that I can then use to layer other materials against. So the way I start my work is I'll start with that base material. So if I just come in here and I start to type in base, you'll see I have a base material. And so what I can do is just drag and drop this right here into my 3D view. And now I have a surface here. And if I come over, you can see I have my workflow. It's set to metallic roughness by default. My preset, I could choose it from any number of these presets. This time here, I'm going to choose just a dielectric. And then here I can come in and just start to interactively adjust my roughness value here. So what we have here is just a node. Now, this node was something I created myself here inside of Substance Designer because this was something I was doing a lot. So Designer is not only a tool about creating materials, but it could also be used to author your own tools, again, to help speed up your workflow. So what I like to do is just have my base material ready. This is like my modeling material to kind of get me started. And then I start just working on my details. So starting with this, we're going to start very small and work our way up. So we're going to start with just a simple grunge map. This is just a noise that I grab here from our library. So if I come over and look at my noises, we ship with a host of these noises. Here in Designer, there's also tools to allow you to create your very own custom procedural noises as well. Or you could just use what we have. 95% of the time, you're just going to use these. I mean, typically you don't have to author your own noises. So here we have this noise map, and you can see here I'm just running a simple high pass filter on this here to get this type of pattern. Then I'm just using a uniform color and blending that together to get this pattern that you see here and just dropping my opacity. Then I just run a levels command on it just to bring up that kind of tonal value range. Then here it's a process of just grabbing another procedural noise from the library. Here I did a transform just to rotate it. And then I'm just, again, blending that back down as well. So now you can see that I'm starting to, here I'm just using opacity and I'm just, layering together a lot of this variation to create a complex texture. So we just start off small and just layer, layer, layer. Here's the next thing here where I'm grabbing another texture, again, a procedural. I can change things like cracks, balance, and so on to get the exact look I want from that procedural. And then I just integrate it back down here with a blend. This time I've switched my blending mode to lighten, and then again, just drop the opacity. So here's the detail that we're starting to grab from that. Moving along, sorry, Fabrice, go ahead.
No, yes, Wes, I was just going to say that, the nodes always look a bit complicated when you first look at it, but then when you explain here, they're all very, very simple operations. Opacity, blend mode, and so just to demystify, it's all very step by step. Each step is very simple.
Oh, yes. And some people ask, like, well, you know, why do that? I mean, like, why do I need to do it this way? And the reason we have it like this is because of the non-destructive nature that this gives you. And as you'll see, we can make changes and borrow from other areas. We can do very complex blending operations that are just not possible in a layer-based system. So here you can see that in the end, I get, kind of a pretty varied result here just by blending some noises together. And so this gives me my final, what I like to call my final height map here. Now, from here, in this particular case, I wasn't really using height so much, but I have this grayscale information. And then from here, I can just simply switch this to normal. So what I want to do now is I have my base material. I come over here to my base material, and I want to start to visualize this here in my 3D scene. So I'll just enable my normal channel. And I can actually just plug this directly here into my normal. So first I need to create normal. So we have a node that does that. So here's how easy it is to create a normal map. You just plug in your grayscale information, and here we have normal. And here I can adjust my intensity. So now if I plug this here into my normal, we start to see some information here in my scene. Now it's pretty reflective or glossy. So here I'm just using my modeling material right now just to get some idea as I create. So I'm just going to increase my roughness a bit. Now, in this particular case, I really like this detail for later when I create my roughness map. We talked about that being, you know, the most important map that we could have. So here I have this roughness map, but you know, for this normal, I think it's too messy. I don't want this much. So what I'm going to do is just actually come back here to maybe this levels and use that instead for my normal. So again, looking at, like you've referred to it, Fabrice, is like your Photoshop history. I'm just going to plug this in as my normal instead. And now I get this value. I could also just insert a levels in between this guy. We've got a levels into here, and I could start to tweak this value as I work here as well. And so you can see it's completely interactive as we work. So now I'm getting maybe more of this type of material. And if for this concrete, I want to invert this, I'm just going to invert my histogram here. And now I get this type of effect. Of course, I can go back to my intensity and lower that intensity value.
That's
so this might,
tip.
yeah. So this might here be my this might be my roughness now. I'm sorry, my normal map here. And so what
if I may interject here, that I'm just thinking about the creative process that, you know, when I would most typically work on a material, I would always start plugging anything in the diffuse so that I would see it. So I would work on the color, but what we're doing here, what you're doing, is working on this micro detail of the texture. And I notice you have the no color, you have just a gray color, so that your instinct would be to straight away work on the granularity of the material with the normal and with the roughness, and the color will come right at the end. So it's almost reminds me of, you know, when you learn to paint, you learn in black and white. You just learn all the skills and the tricks with a very much simplified model, and the color is only coming at the end to complement this materiality. But a lot of us, I don't know about you guys, but me, I would, by starting working with the diffuse, it makes all of the normal and roughness more complicated, and you can see less what you're doing. So this way, it really reminds me of this sort of almost traditional fine art workflow.
Yes, exactly. It really speaks to me. I'm actually a photographer, is what I started my career as. And so as I recall back in college taking photography classes, you always start with black and white. You know, you didn't do color until, you know, you did black and white 1, 2, and 3. And before you know, color just gets in the way. It can be confusing. So precisely, if you nail the surface attribute, like we're talking about here, our roughness. So while we're talking about this, let me integrate my roughness now. So what I do is I just integrate my roughness channel, and I'll plug this guy into here. And so now I have kind of this roughness look in conjunction here with my normal. So again, we're looking at everything as a material. And that's why I use this base material node, because I don't want to look at these channels isolated. I want to look at them together. So now I can come in and say, all right, well, you know what? I do maybe want to come back and increase the intensity now on my normal map. So it's very non-destructive as we work through this. So now you can see that I'm kind of compiling together here this roughness information. And that's basically what I've done here. So one last thing I want to show you as a good trick is for my roughness, after I create that detail, I use this node called a histogram range. And I really love this for creating roughness. And I'll show you how great this is. So this is like what I've, my start. This is what I get all my details from. I'm going to plug this into the range node here. And then I'll just set the range to 1. So this gives me the exact output that I had. But now I have this cool position control. So as I increase this towards 1, I get rough, but I still have some nice intricate detail. And then as I decrease it, you can see I'm getting more smooth. So let's look at that on the model itself. So I'll just plug this here into my roughness. And now I can use this simple slider control here to just increase, kind of dial up my roughness and back. But it's still being controlled based on that grunge map input that I created already. And so with this being a substance, I can now take this position control and simply expose this. And so usually what I do is I'll give it a name. We'll call this roughness. And so that's been exposed. If I double click out in just an empty area of my graph, I can see all my input parameters. And here's my roughness. So that I'll call this test rough so we can see it as the label. And then if I just preview my controls, now I can see that this control, when I export this as a material to UE4, this little slider here is going to be available. And this is what you showed with Source, Fabrice. So this is how you manually create these controls here inside of Substance Designer. And so one last thing I want to show before I move on here is, again, we have our rough information. I'm sorry, our height that I started with. Then I send that here through a gradient map. This is how I create the color information. And so if we look at this gradient editor, it gives us this gradient where we can plot keys and set colors. So it basically remaps those grayscale values going from black to white with these color ranges. And what's awesome about this is that I just simply use this pick gradient tool. And what this does, it gives me this little pick gradient. Now, it looks like on the web page, you're not seeing this icon. I'm sorry, on the webcast, you're not seeing this extra icon.
No, I'm seeing it.
Oh, okay, okay. It just wasn't showing for me. All right, so if I just left click and kind of drag, you see this black line. And when I let go, it just remaps all those gradient keys for me. And so right there, I can just sample some values. And you can sample this from anywhere. So for example, what I do is I just open up a web page, do a search for concrete or whatever, and I find one that has some color values I like, and I just sample those. And it colorizes itself based on this input that I have. And then my color's done. And then maybe do a little levels adjustment. And then I hook it into a hue saturation. And here you can see I expose that lightness control, which Fabrice will show you here in just a moment, so that I could do things like maybe change my saturation or lightness values, some image editing capabilities that I can have directly in UE4. That means I'm not having to jump back and forth. Oh, you know what? That texture's not dark enough. Let me go back to Designer, do a bunch of changes, export a bunch of textures, reload everything. I can just do it all right inside of UE4. Okay, so that's going to really wrap up what I want to show here with Designer. So Fabrice, I think you want to take it away and take a look at this in UE4.
Yeah, let's do that. So I've imported this substance. We walked on with Artifactory. I think Dominique is watching, so shout out to Dominique. And so this was all authored using texture maps, but I just literally imported Wes's substance and drag and dropped it straight onto my mesh. And you can see the result is really, really compelling, especially that this is a very simple substance. Some of these graphs can go incredibly complex. So now, when the texture came, when the substance came, it was sort of roughly this color, kind of gray. So I was just able to change my color from sort of say this color and just change my lightness down with the expose parameter. And so that's how easy it was. And now if I want to play with my roughness, so I can make this material extremely shiny like this, and then just adjust my roughness. And what's great is that it's very extremely sensitive with those very precise values that when it's just right. So, and you can see that the detail, so now I've got a 4K texture inside of Substance. So while I'm there, if you just install the plugin in order to access the 4K, you need to go to project settings, scroll all the way down to your substance in the plugin. And here you need to enable GPU engine. And so you will be able to access these incredibly high res textures from right within Unreal, and it's all super easy. So now this exact same texture I used, this exact same substance I used in this project, and again literally imported it, threw it in, and I've got a very different looking material. So I'm able to, I changed my lightness value again. So instead of having it dark, I just moved it up here, and it adjusted my roughness in the materials in the exposed parameters. So here I've got it fully rough with very little. So to understand, the light is bouncing, the reflection is happening, but because I've got a high roughness amount, it's very diffuse. So it's acting physically correctly, but I'm able to completely tweak it inside of Unreal with great ease. So that's it. That's what we wanted to show. Chris?
Great. Thanks, Fabrice.
We're ready to
yep. Let me
take some.
So hopefully you all can see my slide. I want to thank everyone for hanging around. We're gonna enter into QA time right now. I know that was a long webinar, but it was so jam-packed with some amazing information. So thanks, guys, for doing that. So, feel free to reach out to us at enterprise-news@unrealengine.com. Share with us what you're doing. We'd love to see what everybody's working on. Also, if just a reminder to sign up for the Datasmith beta if you haven't already. unrealengine.com/beta. So I'm going to unshare my screen, and I'm going to bring back Wes and Fabrice, and we'll enter a QA mode, and we'll try to get through these questions. We have about 20 minutes or so to do that. So hopefully you all can stay. I know over an hour is a lot to ask.
All right. Well, let's crack on with some questions. There's a long list here. I'm looking. Wes, if you see anything.
Yeah, go ahead and dive in, guys.
I'm just looking at the caustics in the vals, although it's not substance related, but they were made with light functions. It's very simple. You can download the file and see how I've done it in there.
Okay, so
PBR works on mobile.
There's a question about PBR and mobile.
Yeah, it works on mobile in UE4. I don't see why not, because that's just the way PBR Unreal is PBR and nothing else. So it does.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that for the Substance plugin, we might be having some issues with the Substance plugin on mobile. I'm not 100% sure, so I apologize on that front. But I think that we could be doing some support for that on iOS and Android, but I'm not 100% on that one. So in that case, please just visit the algorithmic forums. We have a UE4 specific thread, and I'm definitely there to answer any questions and find out more information from the devs on that.
Okay, we've got an interesting one. So from Mark, do these values in any way correspond to the gloss units values you derive from a gloss meter? So I don't know what a gloss meter is, but this is exactly...
That question, I saw when that question came in, it was when you were talking about, I believe it was the Fresnel slide.
Right.
Yeah, I was wondering in that case if they were talking about the roughness information, when we were talking about the roughness map, perhaps...
Yes, that's what I assume.
Oh, maybe that was it. Yeah, maybe that was it.
Yeah. In that case, in that, I would say, I don't know. I guess it technically could. You could get some information, but really, it's not so much something that you're having to use. Some type of meter or something to calibrate to really extrapolate that rough information, because really, like I said, that's a map that you can't really do incorrectly, so that's one that it's really going to be more that I would say that map is more about I would say, more about artistic interpretation than it is so much about worrying about having, using a meter to measure the roughness value and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of what we were saying as well, that here it's going to be how alive your material will be, how it's aged and how it's been used. So this is very much where the artistic creation happens.
So there's one question here about where can we find the chart for the PBR values you mentioned earlier. I will actually get a link for that.
Actually, you're talking about Sebastian's link.
Yes, he actually has one for that's specific to UE4.
Yep, I have it right here. I'll copy it right in, and I did put it in earlier, but it's just been missed in the chat. There, I just put it back in there. This is for those specific ones for UE4.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about Datasmith.
Hold on, let me get back over to that.
Chris, does the V-Ray material setup get converted into the roughness?
Yeah, that's right. So when we say V-Ray is supported, so what we're doing is we're looking at the V-Ray shaders, we're looking at the maps that are used in there, and where it makes sense to make a one-to-one correspondence with an Unreal shader, it gets converted into an Unreal shader. Everything is getting converted at this point. So if it makes sense that there's a one-to-one conversion, we do that. We're currently, since Datasmith is only in beta at this point, we're looking at which of the most popular shaders that are being used, and we'll either create a custom shader in Unreal for that, or we'll map it somehow. I don't know if you saw the Unreal Engine user event video from SIGGRAPH this year, where we introduced Datasmith at the very end of my section of the presentation. Vlado from Chaos Group came out and announced V-Ray support directly in the engine. And he intimated that they were working on V-Ray shaders, V-Ray native shaders for the engine as well. But there's no timeline on that. But yeah, it's getting converted at the moment. And we're working with Chaos Group to see when we'll get native shaders.
So there's an interesting question here. Is it possible to control Substance Materials performance for VR ArcViz project? So the idea of performance is interesting here, because as I understand it, everything is pre-calculated. So in game, as it were, Substance doesn't interfere. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, what happens is, like I said, the textures, depending on what you have set. So, for example, in those general preferences that you showed, Fabrice, we can set things about we call it generation mode, on how those substances are generated. So they could be baked and discarded, and so on. So for example, if you're going to author or publish to a platform that's not going to support any type of runtime parameter changes, then you might just use bake and discard, which is just going to bake the textures and discard the substance itself. So that could be like bare minimum, I'm going to use this on mobile. This is what I want to do. But the runtime parameters can be changed, but that can be pretty intensive because you're actually having the engine recompute these textures at runtime, and typically that's not something you're definitely not going to want to do per frame. So we typically see this used a lot when, let's say that you have a level is loading and you want to, and it's maybe a procedural level, and you could hit a random seed value on your textures and have them kind of randomize a bit, things like that. Or we see it a lot when people make avatars or customizable characters and they want to be able to change like clothing sliders and so on. They'll do that with Substance and so on. So in those particular cases, you want to take a look at the generation modes and make decisions on how you want these substances to be used. So something with VR that's going to be, very, very strict in terms of performance requirements and so on, I would say that you're going to want to just, bake and discard that substance.
Okay, there's loads of new questions coming in. So can a Substance shader be blended with a UE4 shader into a new UE4 shader? So again, just to make it clear, Substance authors the textures, and the shader can be completely compiled and created inside of Unreal.
Yeah, that's correct. We don't actually create any shaders at all. All we do is the textures. So when you import the substance, all we do is create a UV4 material, and our textures are just automatically input into the UV4 material. So you can absolutely do any other type of nodes or blending. Actually, I did a video that's on our algorithmic channel where I took a substance I made that was ground, and then I blended it with another substance that was another ground, and I used vertex painting inside of UE4 to help blend those two substances together. And so that was something I had to do within the UE4 material to set up the blending between the substances, or it could have been another texture. It didn't have to be a substance. So absolutely, you can do that.
What else?
I see a question here about the BRDF is baked into Unreal Engine 4, or can we somehow provide custom BRDFs? My knowledge is that it is baked. So the BRDF is it's based on the principled PBR shader, so it's going to be using GGX. And from my knowledge, that is hard coded, and there isn't a way to change that BRDF. Now, I could be wrong. I'm not an expert with Unreal Engine material, but I'm pretty sure you can't do that.
Yeah, I think so too.
Can you texture a model with PBR materials, light it, then create a flat texture for using other engines? I'm sorry, Axel, I don't understand that question.
Where do you see that one?
Who asked it?
Axel, right at the top. Texture model for use. Oh, I think. Well, yeah. What he's asking is whether the texture can be reused in other engines, and that's exactly what Substance.
Oh,
does,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So, for example, this is Unreal Engine, but let's just say that you were using Unity as well. Since Unity supports metallic rough or spec gloss, you could take that same substance that we authored and use it in Unreal. And then if you had to do something within Unity, you could use it in there as well. The exact same material. So it can be authored in any way that you need it to. There's also ways that you can make your own outputs too from Substance Designer. So let's say that you're working on some type of customized version of Unreal Engine, and you need to do that. Like, we've actually had some studios, one of my favorite studios, I don't think I can actually mention it, but they make a game that I absolutely love. That's an Unreal Engine game. And they actually have kind of a customized version of UE4 where they're not using roughness, but they're using smoothness. So it's a little similar to what Unity does with their metallic roughness, where it's a metallic workflow, but it's not roughness, it's smoothness. It's just a gloss map. It's the opposite. So within those kind of cases, you could create a substance that lets you work with those specific outputs as well. It depends on, if you're using a very customized version of the engine or not. So yeah, a lot of flexibility with Substance.
Yeah, well, I haven't actually tried it yet, but to export a mask or a grunge map that could be applied to your shader on a completely different UV map tiling section, I thought that could be used to export tiles or maps to be used within the shader, but not straight plugged into the inputs.
Oh yeah, exactly. Like, we have a lot of studios that do that. You guys at Epic are doing some things like that using Substance Painter. So on Paragon, we had several of the team members. Brad Smith, just special shout out to Brad at Epic now. He's a good friend, and he did a presentation for us showing that, which Paragon looks absolutely amazing. It's a cool game, and it was really cool to see how they were using procedural masks, some of them done in Painter as well for the blending.
Cool.
Great. I saw a question earlier on, somebody saying about how to light. So I refer back maybe to my little new lighting course or the, webinar number 3, where you talked about lighting.
Exactly. Does roughness relate to roughness in V-Ray and Corona? If it's a physically based shader of any type and has that input, yes, you could use the roughness maps that you generate. That's what I do. Use the roughness maps that you generate in Substance and plug those into those slots. So yeah,
Yeah, I'm not 100%. I haven't worked with V-Ray in just a bit, but in a while. But we recently added this rendering documentation section to our integrations part of our documentation. So that's a good place to check out there, where we actually show how substances work with V-Ray and Corona. And so within there, I do believe that that both are using roughness and not gloss. So yeah, it would work the exact same. What it really comes down to is, has there been any remapping done? Because sometimes I've seen there's some implementations that can actually do some type of remapping on the gloss. So I think with V-Ray, it might be squared. So it's like a roughness squared. And I'm just trying to think. We might have something like that. But anyways, it's been detailed in our documentation. So if you go to our documentation for our software, you'll see there's an integrations space. If you just go into there underneath rendering, you'll see we have a whole new series of information on rendering for various renders, specifically on Corona. We actually have been focusing on ArcViz and design for these renderers. So like I said, we have Corona and we have Keyshot as well as V-Ray.
Okay. Looks like in material maps, roughness seems to be the most important one to bring out the look of the material. I would probably say so. I mean, it's the one that I go to and edit the most in terms of getting really good quality, light bounces and reflectance and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, I would agree as well.
Okay. So Axel is clarifying his question. Can I use create textures for engines that are PBR and then use them in non-PBR? So again, this is completely the point of substance, whereas that you can output any maps and you can, as you've shown us, you create your base texture and then you're going output at different points in time or different levels of modification of the base map. You can output these into practically any node you want that's available.
Yeah. And there's a program, Algorithmic has an application called Bitmap to Material, which you can take if you've already created and exported a map, or you have a map from another source that wasn't originally done in Designer or Painter. You can load it into Bitmap to Material and you can extract an albedo map or a diffuse color map and use that as well. But Designer, if you're working in Designer, and Wes, I mean, I don't want to answer it for you, but if you're working in Designer, you can export any one of the flavors of maps that you need, whether it's albedo or, diffuse color, take your pick.
Well, looking at that question, I'm kind of wondering too. I think that what they might be meaning is that, so they're talking about lighting. So if you, like, for example, you look at that 3D view that I had in Designer where you could actually see the light and the reflection, everything. It sounds like they're saying, can I bake that to a texture and then use that somewhere else? And so the answer to that question would be no, we don't have that. Now, one of the things that we do have, like in Substance Painter, is we have a, well, you can't, I think you, okay, sorry. I think you can do it in Designer. So in Substance Painter, we have a filter called the Bake Lighting filter, which does just that. So you apply that and it allows you to bake some lighting. So you could have like 2 different types of lights and some reflection, and you can bake, and then you can export just the base color map, which would have the lighting and the roughness and for like the reflection stuff baked into the base color. And then you'd have your normal map that you could use as source.
Right. I mean, I understand the question if he wants to go mobile and things like that, but honestly, that really kind of defeats the purpose of PBR, right? Because the purpose of PBR materials is that they look physically accurate in the specific given lighting situation. So if you bake the lighting into the PBR texture, it's not a PBR texture anymore because the lighting information is baked in, and it's only going to represent the lighting at that point in time.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And the reason why we created this bake lighting filter was that we had some of our users and who were wanting to do that. It was like a special use case scenario where they were using mobile, where they had no lights or anything like that. So I want to say that it can work in Designer as well, because that filter was actually created in Designer and then used in Painter. So like I said, Designer's material creation, but it's also a really, really flexible tool for creating all types of utilities and such. So shout out to Nicholas Weirman. He's a substance ninja at Algorithmic who creates these filters and things. And so I think that might be part of Designer. I'm sorry, I'm not sure off the top of my head. But yeah, you're right, Chris. It would nullify the PBR aspect of it.
Right. We have about 3 minutes left on the Q&A, so we're plowing through some questions. Super quick. V-Ray for UE. You have to check with Chaos Group. I didn't, in their announcement, they didn't provide a timeline. I don't know a timeline. And so I can't help you there. Can UE
I heard there's going to...
What?
Yeah, they said it's going to take a long time. So
yeah,
nowhere near ready from what I've heard.
Yeah. Can UE for blueprints use the substance parameters?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. If you go to our integrations page, we have a really nice breakdown of how all that works. And we actually have I'm trying to think of the word, a table, I guess, I don't know, that kind of describes each of the blueprint nodes and everything. So yeah, completely. Also, we have some training on our YouTube channel that shows how to actually do that if you're interested.
Great.
So the interesting question about how do you delight or photo scan? I saw a great tutorial on this Substance website for that. You can do it yourself with your mobile phone. They explain how they did it for leather, and but it's quite complicated. I think the bitmap to material might be the easiest way to go.
Yeah, well, we actually have what you're talking about there, Fabrice, was actually an article that was on how to use like a phone or a camera to create your own scans, and then how to compile those together. That was done by Anthony Salvi, again, another wizard from Algorithmic. He's actually just published a new article, which is very, very good in 3D World. So that's going to be coming up soon. I'd highly recommend checking that out. But in terms of delighting, though, we don't have a specific delighting tool. Well, we do have bitmap to material, which does have some lighting removal in it. But as far as like a delighting where you can take the scan information and actually extrapolate like reflection information out of it, we are actually working on that process now. So that'll be another feature that we add to Designer down the road.
Great.
Okay.
I see a couple I can hit really quick. There's one here. Does this work with Blender cycles? Yes, it does. We have Anthony from Algorithmic. He does a lot of work with Blender. And so, yeah, it was just the other day, he gave me a really great presentation on using Substance in Blender cycles, and it worked awesome. So total support there. And then one other question here, experience with triplanar projections and Substance textures. We do support that. So in Painter, you can use triplanar on any fill layer. And then within Designer, we have triplanar as part of an actual node. So for instance, you could take one of those grunge maps that I had, you could bake information about the model being like its world space and position, and then feed that into the triplanar node. Then you have a host of controls that allow you to change how the projection is working across all axes, whether it be the offset or the rotation.
Right. Okay, everyone. It is 20 after the hour. We have jammed through a ton of questions, and we've held actually everybody in the room. Over 270 people stayed in the room this whole time. So,
well done, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. It's a lot of information. I want to thank obviously Fabrice and Wes for doing an amazing job. I love doing these webinars because not only do I get to participate in, but what you guys are presenting, I'm here taking notes. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. So that's right. It's really great. It's really great. So, and of course, thanks to everyone who attended. Shout out to a lot of friends I noticed in the room. My friends from Studio Niscoda, Dean and Chop. Thanks for stopping in today. So we're going to end things now. The webinar, you'll be getting a link or an email here in a short amount of time, probably less than 2 hours, with a link to the survey. So please fill out the survey. There will also be a link to the replay. The replay will stay up indefinitely. So as long as you have that email, you'll always have a link to the replay. I want to thank everyone for taking the time, and we'll see you guys in webinar number 5. So take care, everyone. See ya.
Thank you.
All right. See you guys.